Hi, good morning, and welcome to the ZP Developer Zone. So every week we do a webinar at 8 a.m. London time. I'm just getting a bit of feedback, so I'll just stop that now. But every Thursday at 8 a.m. London time, we like to do a webinar specifically for our ZP Developer Zone, and this is that webinar. So appreciate you guys that come along every week. So let's basically dive straight into it then. So every week we do a webinar for the members of our developer zone, and I sort of put this slide up. We do this webinar for the developer zone. We have the developer zone web page itself, which I know which all of you are kind of members on. We have the ZP Academy. We have our collaborations. And I just want to say on the collaborations that one of the ZP Developer Zone members is actually going to come to London very soon and spend 3 months with ZP. So one of the benefits of being a ZP Developer Zone collaborator is actually, we will support people's efforts to come and directly collaborate with us. So I'm not going to mention who it is, but one of the ZP Developer Zone members, who's been a member for quite some time, is actually going to come to London pretty soon. Obviously, it's a little difficult with the COVID-19, but it's, as I say, one of the members is coming. So thank you, and I'm looking forward to receiving you. We're also advertising jobs on the ZP Developer Zone as well. And also, if you have jobs or PhD positions available, you can also post them on the ZP Developer Zone as well. So we're delighted to have collaborations. We're delighted that we've got the ZP Developer Zone website, and we're also delighted that we're posting jobs and positions on the Developer Zone, and we're delighted that you can also post positions on the ZP Developer Zone as well. Now, what we do with the ZP Developer Zone is, you can basically ask questions of each other and ask questions of us at ZP, and then we can have these webinars where we can actually have those kind of answers. So the live streaming that we're doing today, and I appreciate that I can sort of see Hicham online and Hasim's online. It's the content of this live streaming is basically driven by the forum. So in the forum, people can ask questions, and so one of our new members has kind of asked, are there data sheets? And there are data sheets for the ZP sensors, but his question is that give ideal max-min voltages, temperature, operational distances, sensitivities, or other parameters of that nature. So I think with this question, we sort of dug into it a little bit, and I said, all right, well, let's talk about glucose, and he said, let's talk about lactate a bit. So we're going to address that particular question, which was really around about what factors affect biosensors. Now, I'm going to the quick answer is it's a complicated answer, and that's why we need to do a sort of webinar on it. So let me just go to the next slide. So I'm going to talk about glucose today and the factors that affect the sensitivity or the signal of glucose. But this conversation is equally applicable to the glucose sensor, the lactate sensor, the alcohol sensor, and the uric acid sensor. Now I've singled those 4 sensors out from the ZP biosensor portfolio because they're all based on oxidase enzymes. Glucose oxidase, lactate oxidase, alcohol oxidase, and the uric acid oxidase. So essentially, though they have different analytes and different enzymes, they're all from the oxidase class of enzymes. And in a minute, I'll talk about the sort of bioelectrochemistry behind these types of sensors, and you'll see essentially that they all end in hydrogen peroxide. So the question has come from the forum: what parameters, influence the signal from biosensors? And I've decided, right, well, we're going to do the one of the biggest class of biosensors, or the biggest biosensor in the world, is probably the glucose sensor, which comes from a class of sensors that use oxidase as the sensing element. And as I say, even though I'm going to talk about glucose now, it applies equally to 1, 2, 3, and 4 other sensors on the ZP portfolio. So let's talk about the bioelectrochemistry of these biosensors, these these oxidase-based sensors. So they have this is obviously a zoom in on a ZP glucose sensor. Now on it will have an enzyme, and now that enzyme is essentially reacting with the glucose. So we have glucose in the presence of the enzyme, and importantly the presence of oxygen. And that's a good point, because I haven't discussed oxygen, but in order for many of these oxidase enzymes to work, they obviously need, they actually need oxygen as well. So that has to be in the sample. Not at high concentration, but it does have to be in the sample. And now we have the conversion of glucose in the presence of oxygen to glucolactone, which reacts to gluconic acid. It's interesting, but it's not the important point of this webinar. The important point of this webinar is what are the parameters that affect biosensors. And so I've narrowed it down and said, all right, let's talk about these biosensors that are based on oxidase enzymes. And these oxidase enzymes all have a common feature, which is the analyte reacts with the enzyme in the presence of oxygen, and we get essentially the generation of hydrogen peroxide. Now, the question that came in from the forum was, well, what kind of parameters, do I need to control or understand in order to make these sensors work? And one of them is, we're going to detect that hydrogen peroxide now on our electrodes. And if it's what we call a generation 1 sensor, essentially we apply 650 millivolts between the working electrode and the reference electrode. And that then allows us to flow essentially a current. So what we end up with is a current. You could call that raw signal, but a current when we apply 650 millivolts is proportional to essentially the glucose. So essentially the glucose in the sample is converted to by the enzyme into hydrogen peroxide as long as there's sufficient oxygen, and as long as you're applying a voltage like 650 millivolts, then your current is proportional to glucose. What the instruments are doing is they're actually applying 650 millivolts between these two electrodes, between the working and the reference. So I want to bring it back to the original question, which is the original question was kind of like what parameters are important really around biosensing, and then I've narrowed it down to the oxidase based ones. And essentially one of the important parameters is the voltage that you apply. So that's a kind of an electrical parameter. Now I'm going to focus in on that hydrogen peroxide itself, because there's a very important step at the end of this, and we call this basically a cascade of glucose. And there's electrons in the glucose that get transferred to, those electrons get transferred to the enzyme. The enzyme essentially transfers those electrons to the oxygen, which becomes hydrogen peroxide, and eventually the electrons from the hydrogen peroxide get transferred to the electrode, and so there's a cascade. Now, I've said, right, voltage is important, and I've said it's 650 millivolts. I am going to actually drill in a bit more why that magic 650 millivolts has come from. But discussion on hydrogen peroxide. So if you're in biosensor development, you're in that biosensor community, you are gonna sort of learn to love hydrogen peroxide. It is a important molecule. If you're doing sometimes people are doing immunoassays, and you'll see that when they're doing immunoassays there might be an enzyme involved called HRP, horseradish peroxidase. There's a hint there that the peroxidases are also associated with hydrogen peroxide. So hydrogen peroxide is an important molecule in biosensors. So let's discuss this hydrogen peroxide a bit. Now here we have a cyclovoltammogram of 0 millimolar hydrogen peroxide. Now, if you're not sure about cyclovoltammetry, there's 2 free courses on the ZP Developer Zone which will cover cyclovoltammetry. Or Zimmer and Peacock has a lot of, we do a lot, it comes up a lot in our webinars and a lot in our ZP Developer Zone discussions, but cyclovoltammetry is a technique for sort of analyzing, let's say, chemicals using electrochemistry. So what we have here is the cyclovoltammetry of just buffer, and then into the experiment, we've added hydrogen peroxide, and there's an increase in the signal from going from 0 millimolar hydrogen peroxide to 3.5 millimolar hydrogen peroxide. When you look along my scale here, you can see that essentially, well, the hydrogen peroxide, it has a kind of wave associated with it, and that wave, very hard to see, but there's actually what we call an inflection. It sort of, it goes up, it slightly turns and then goes up again. So there's a kind of, there's an inflection point here. Now I know it's, you know, you say, well, that's very subtle, you know, I can't really see it, but essentially there's 2 processes going on here. We have the hydrogen peroxide here, and then there's a second process that kind of kicks in here. And if we let this voltage go up, it would suddenly really shoot up. So I said in the previous slide, you know, we've got this cascade that ends with hydrogen peroxide. And so if you want to understand the parameters that influence a biosensor, especially ones that have hydrogen peroxide associated with them, then you have to understand hydrogen peroxide. So first of all, the 650 millivolts comes because we see it as the we see it as what we call the kind of Goldilocks voltage. Let me just discuss that a little bit. I just want to kind of say that with electrochemistry, you don't want to apply too little voltage because you won't oxidize the molecule of interest. And you don't want to apply too much voltage, because if you apply too much voltage, you'll end up doing the hydrolysis of water. So you want a signal that's specific to hydrogen peroxide. Too little voltage and you will barely oxidize the hydrogen peroxide, and that will therefore limit your glucose signal. You won't have linear glucose signal because essentially you can't oxidize all the hydrogen peroxide that reaches the electrode. And too much voltage, and you'll end up doing a secondary reaction, which is the hydrolysis of water. So I said to you that, you know, we have, when you look at no millimolar hydrogen peroxide, 0 millimolar hydrogen peroxide, then we add in hydrogen peroxide, you get this new wave, and there's an inflection point here. And we essentially want to add enough voltage to oxidize hydrogen peroxide, but not so much voltage that we end up doing the hydrolysis of water. And so there's a sort of sweet window of voltage that we really want to be in. And I kind of thought, I've kind of called it the Goldilocks voltage for this webinar, because essentially you don't want too much voltage and you don't want too little voltage. So obviously, if any of you know the story of Goldilocks and the 3 bears, you know, some of the porridge was just a bit too cool and some of the porridge was just a bit too hot. But you actually just want to be in a really good zone. So 650 millivolts is a kind of compromise that we want to oxidize the hydrogen peroxide, but we don't want to start doing the hydrolysis of water. So that's why we talk about 650 millivolts for the detection of hydrogen peroxide. So if I roll back a little bit, the inquiries was what parameters are important or significant around biosensors. And so first of all, we've discussed, that by biosensors, there's thousands of sensors that fall into the category of biosensors. It's probably worth noting that the biggest biosensor on the market is still the glucose sensor. And when you're discussing glucose sensors, you can often be discussing glucose oxidase, at which point this whole conversation is also relevant then to the other biosensors that use glucose oxidase, which included the lactate oxidase-based sensors, the uric acid oxidase sensors, the alcohol oxidase sensors. So this is why we use 650 millivolts. Another parameter that affects this class of biosensors is actually the pH. So here, and these pHs are a little extreme, but essentially it says that the signal, the current that we get, increases as the pH increases. So as we go from pH 10, which I know is a little extreme, to pH 13, which I again agree is a little extreme, essentially the hydrogen peroxide becomes easier to oxidize and the current goes up. So the signal from a sensor that has hydrogen peroxide in its sensing mechanism can be influenced by pH. So that could be a bit of a problem. So essentially showing that the signal can change as a function of pH. Now, in the question from our forum member, so don't forget this whole webinar is because if you're a ZP Developer Zone member, you're absolutely allowed, and we love it, that you ask questions on the forum and then we use the webinar to answer it. He specifically asked about temperature. So let's just discuss temperature, the effect of temperature on biosensors. Essentially, it's kind of this, that the output from a biosensor is temperature sensitive, especially when you think about, we have enzymes in there. So essentially, you can't just apply 100 degrees Celsius to a glucose sensor because it has an enzyme in there and that will definitely denature the enzyme. But this data, which I've referenced here, is a good example of showing you that the signal, in this case, they had their best signal at 50 degrees C and their least signal at 2 degrees C. Now at Zimmer and Peacock, we often, when we're giving out characterization data or data on our website about biosensors, we're often just doing it at room temperature. Now our facility is quite well controlled, so I think it's not a parameter that we think about too much because we have really state-of-the-art clean rooms, and yeah, the temperature is well controlled in them. Hi Dima. So I just want to kind of say that that temperature is not something we worry about too much, but actually the sensors are sensitive to temperature, and as you can see, quite clearly in this here, that the signal goes up as a function of temperature. But you can't just keep on increasing the temperature, increasing the signal, because essentially enzymes will denature the higher the temperature. Glucose oxidase is quite a robust enzyme, whereas lactate oxidase is quite feeble in comparison. And so lactate, I suspect, would you would not get this linearity up to 50 degrees C because the enzyme couldn't withstand it. So let's talk about parameters on the signal. So essentially we have a signal that's proportional to the analyte, be it glucose, lactate, uric acid or alcohol. Good, that's what we want. But we also have a signal that's also proportional to temperature, pH and voltage. So what are we going to do about this? So what we're going to do is, whoopsie daisy, is we want the signal to be proportional to analyte, that's good. But we've also got a temperature effect, a pH effect, and a voltage effect. So what do you do about temperature? With temperature, you either fix it or you calibrate for it. So at ZP, because we're working in quite temperature controlled environments, then in fact we're essentially isothermal. So temperature does not appear in our signals. If you're really going to be working with a sensor that's going to be you really expect it to be working sometimes from 10 degrees to 30 degrees, you're really going to have to calibrate it. I think in most real world applications, temperature is not always so variable as that. But essentially you're either going to have to fix the temperature or you're going to have to calibrate for the effect of temperature. Now, what do we do about pH? Essentially you just buffer it. Now when I think about real world samples, if you were testing glucose in food, often food is not in this extreme pH range. The pH is fairly well fixed. If you're doing the glucose in blood doesn't have a variable pH. It has actually quite a well buffered, well controlled pH of around about 7.2. So it's not actually such a concern. Oops, yeah, and voltage is easy. You just fix it. You just set it and leave it there. So the signal, what parameters, what things in nature affect the glucose signal or biosensor signal, the temperature, so fix it, or you're going to have to calibrate for it. pH, buffer the sample actually rather conveniently is often quite controlled anyway, and the voltage is also could be a variable for your signal, so just fix it is our advice. I just want to give a health warning on biosensors. So if you're trying to make a biosensor for a medical application, or you're trying to make a medical product that's based on biosensors, just know that at Zimmer and Peacock, we have, at this point, the company is 52 people. You know, so, and what we do is we time track all our efforts, so we can exactly say this project or this medical biosensor took this much effort. And so I absolutely want to tell you that in order to get a biosensor at a medical grade onto the market and start getting through things like CE marking or FDA approval, it's going to be over 20,000 hours worth of effort. So essentially, most working years is 2,000 hours worth of effort. So you're talking about 10 person years, if it was just one person working alone, in order to make a medical grade biosensor and product. So biosensing is not easy, and if it was easy, so Phil Wong is just asking a quick question. I'll just read it quickly. So Phil is asking, do you think do you think we can use gold electrodes to replace carbon electrodes? Will give a better result. Immobilize mixed oxides on SP, but this is not significant. Phil, I might. Phil's got a question online. I might say, Phil, put that into the forum because it's going to take a little while to answer your question. So, this is a live streaming and people are allowed to answer questions. I would just say, post in forum and then we'll answer it next week in the webinar because it's quite a long answer in the webinar. Right, so just a health warning, and this goes to the original inquiry as well. Making a really good biosensor that's well characterized for applications, especially medical applications, is something like 20,000 hours worth of effort alone. At ZP, for example, we're putting in these kind of hours of effort, but we're spreading it over teams of like 32 people. So it is. So the ZP Developer Zone, we're here to support the community, but of course we're also here to sort of let the community know that you come to a certain level of proof of principle, but then there's a next level where you really want to get this stuff on the market. And ZP is good at that, and we support people to do that. That's our business. But I just want to kind of say, you have to manage your expectations about how much you can actually achieve, and it's a big effort to really make robust biosensors. And somebody here is asking, send them a link to the forum as well. So at the end of this, I will put a link to the forum in the description down below. All right. I just want to touch on the ZP Academy a little bit, and just kind of we're sort of running out of time a little bit now. So I just want to touch on the Academy and say we do have these free resources on the ZP Academy, Introduction to Biosensors. This is relevant to the original inquirer. And we also have electrochemical techniques for biosensor developers, and that's also free, and that's also relevant to the original inquirer. So if you want to dig a little bit deeper into biosensors, I would definitely take a look at those courses. I want to go a bit quicker now because we only do this webinar for 30 minutes every week. People like Hasima are present, and Hasima always has meetings, so I have to kind of be quick. I just want you to say, look, go to the knowledge base, have a look at application zone. Because what I want to say is under the application zone, I'm just going to go to the website now, knowledge base, application zone. There's some good videos of actually showing us doing actual experiments. And I just want to kind of say that, if you want to see a glucose biosensor demonstration, and I'm just going to pause for a second. Even in this video here, you can see that we're using 650 millivolts. And in this video, Andre, one of our guys, he runs a complete glucose demonstration. So you'll see him at one point add the glucose and watch the signal change. So he's describing the data at the moment. He's saying this is like the break-in time, and that it's going to reach some sort of plateau. And then what he's going to do is he's going to get some glucose into the pipette tip, and he's going to add it to the sensor. And he's got good hands. He's got lots of experience. It's worth saying that Hasim has been to, Hasim's one of the members. Is one of them has been to Norway, and he's been in these labs. So here he adds the glucose. So if you want to get a more practical experience about this, then this is a good substitute, because what happens there is the signal jumps up, because essentially the enzyme is producing the hydrogen peroxide. So just want to say, look, there is that material, so you can actually watch these experiments. So that's probably worth something worth noting. Take a look at that. Now next week I'm going to do a bit more on Julie, because as Hasim says in the comments, we've only got 3 minutes left. So if you haven't registered for Julie, please register for Julie, because next week we're going to do a bit more demo. So go to Knowledge Base, sign up for Julie, and we will do a bit more work on Julie next week. And also know that Julie, there's a learning center with it, and we actually have data. This is, so you can essentially use our data to train yourself on Julie. So we have some pH data here under called chronopotentiometry data, and chronoamperometry data. That's genuine glucose data. So next week I'm going to do a demonstration of Julie, where I will use this data. I will upload it to Julie and then analyze it. So register for Julie, download this data, and next week we'll do a demonstration around that. So the idea of Julie is you can go in the lab, you can gather your glucose data using the software, but then how you can analyze the data, you can analyze the data through Julie. I'll go a bit quicker. There's also, so you can self-register for this. I know one of the members of the Developer Zone asked me for a discount code, which I gave them, of course, so you can get some training from the ZP Academy. It's 100% free. Just get a discount code from us. We will do that. I also want to kind of just mention that I'm a big fan of this Sensit Smart. It's got a very low price, and I also just want to kind of say that there's a little video out there about, again, featuring Andre, where he uses the Sensit Smart, and you can get the Sensit Smart through our website. Essentially, the Sensit Smart is plugging into an Android phone. On this phone, he actually has a glucose sensor, and in the experiment, what he's doing is he's got Coke and Diet Coke. So he puts it in Diet Coke, which contains no glucose, and then he essentially transfers the entire sensor across to the original Coke, which does contain glucose, and the signal will increase proportionally. So he's holding it in the sample, which is just Diet Coke at the moment, and then he essentially he's transferring it across, and then the signal. So this is his kind of break-in, this is his baseline, and then the signal comes up, just like one of the other videos. But I just wanted to show you that these sensors do work in the real world as well, because this is Coke. So as Hasim says, we are getting near the end now, so I will go a bit quicker. But if you're in Indonesia and you're interested in that Sensit Smart, please talk to Hasim about that. So next week we'll do a bit more of a demonstration of Julie. So it's 8:30, 10 seconds in the UK. So thank you for being members of the ZP Developer Zone. Yes, and Hasim's asking, do all of us have access to for Julie for free? Yes, you do, Hasim. It's a free service for you guys. Just register. It comes to me for approval. I'll approve it. You're in. So thank you for being members of the Developer Zone. Thank you, as Hasim says, post your questions on the forum. Especially Phil Wong had quite a long question, which if it goes on the forum, we'll do it next week in the webinar. Please sign up for Julie. And that's it. So thank you very much. Julie's free. Phil, please get onto the forum. I'll put a link to the forum down below. And yeah, I appreciate it all. As I say, we just want to be 30 minutes every week. We're very sincere about supporting the Developer Zone. I appreciate all you guys. All right. Thanks very much. Cheers, Hasim.